Welcome back. Yesterday on Black News Tonight, we reported on the guilty verdict in the trial of Ed Buck. Tuesday afternoon, a jury in Los Angeles convicted the former political donor of 9 federal charges related to the overdose deaths of 2 black men, Gemmel Moore, who died in 2017, and Timothy Dean, who died 18 months later. Jasmyne Cannick, who has been covering the case for the last 4 years, had this to say after the verdict.
This was a case that intersected politics. People are still ignoring this case. The people who took Ed Buck's money are still ignoring us because they refuse to admit what has happened. And if we don't admit what has happened, it will happen again.
Joining us now to talk about the trial and what it all means is advocate, activist, and journalist Jasmyne Cannick. Thank you so much for joining me. You know, part of this idea of even you being a journalist, right, and you have certainly become one doing this during this trial, is that you had to do the work that other media outlets wouldn't. You had to cover this.
So I've been a journalist for like over 20 years, radio, television, and in print, but I work in politics. I could have been a full-time journalist, but I chose not to be. I wanted to work in politics. But yeah, I did write about it. Initially, when I wrote about it, it was just to write about what happened to Gemmel. But when that happened, all of these other young men just started hitting me up saying, hey, I know this guy. Let me tell you about him. Let me show you these videos. Let me show you these text messages and these photos. And very clearly a pattern was developing that we saw very early on, right? And then, yeah, I did try to get other people to cover it, but, you know, he's a white dude in West Hollywood with some money. And I got to tell you, I had lots of people tell me that their lawyers said no because he may sue them. So that's what we were up against, right? And it really wasn't until the second man died, Timothy Dean, that I think people started to pay more attention and take things seriously. Look, the man was found guilty yesterday of 9 counts. You listed off the counts regarding Gemmel Moore and Timothy Dean. We had quite a few of his victims. He has a lot of surviving victims because he's been at this for quite some time, who came in and testified and were witnesses. And those represent counts 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, you know? So he had people that came in who are alive and were able to sit in court and say, this is who this man is. So we are so happy. 4 years to the day that Gemmel Moore died in his apartment.
You said after the trial yesterday, if we don't admit what happened, it will happen again. What happened that we need to make sure it doesn't happen again?
So in Los Angeles, you and I, Marc, are the face of homelessness. Come to LA, all you see is black men and women sleeping on the street. We're everywhere. And it's because of our unhoused crisis that men like Ed Buck could get black men to play Russian roulette with their life, literally with the white devil, just so that they could have money to eat with or a roof over their head. Remember, see, his victims were HIV positive. A lot of them were HIV positive. A lot of them were unhoused. A lot of them were also addicts. Some of them were crystal meth addicts. He turned them into addicts, okay? And each one of them, at least the ones that testified in court, said, I only did this because I didn't want to sleep on the street again tonight. And he knew that he could use his money to persuade vulnerable people like that to do that. So if we keep ignoring this situation, we're basically going to have a repeat of it. Ed Buck isn't the only Ed Buck. And all the people who are the powers that be that are silent about it, they are the enablers of Ed Buck. All the people he gave his money to, my mayor, all these other people. I got a council member here who called them disadvantaged black hustlers. That's how they looked at them. They didn't even see them as people. And the message yesterday was very clear. The message is that I don't care. You can be a black gay sex worker. You can be an escort. You can be HIV positive. You can even be a crystal meth addict and homeless. It doesn't matter. Your life does matter. And if someone is taking advantage of you in the very worst ways, we have a responsibility as black people specifically to step up and speak out and make sure that that doesn't happen. As black people, we got enough problems in this world without people like Ed Buck killing us off.
Wow. You talked about the silencing that's going on regarding what Ed Buck and others did to victims and survivors. You also spoke about the intersections of class, race, and sexual orientation. There's this other piece here that I want to talk about just a little bit. You started to talk about it, and that's the idea of HIV status. And there's this idea of being unhoused, what some people refer to as homeless. These are two issues that in many ways made those victims disposable. I can't help but think about what rapper DaBaby said at Rolling Loud the other day about HIV/AIDS and people who are going to die next week, and disparaging, gay black men in his comments on stage. It seems to me that there's some connection here between the kind of shaming and stigma of HIV/AIDS and the disposability of gay folk and what's happening in the Ed Buck trial.
Exactly. So, look, I'm the L in LGBTQ, so I've been a part of the community for quite some time, and I love my brothers, right? And you're exactly right, Mark. We see these, not we, some people see them as disposable, but here's the thing. We have to look at the entire issue here. And what I'm afraid of right now is, like, everybody's happy that we got this guilty verdict, but when the cameras go away and no one is talking about it, these men are still going to be homeless and on the street, right? And as it relates to HIV and AIDS, what happened in the trial is that Christopher Darden, Christopher Darden, represented Ed Buck. That was for optics, and that was clearly strategic. He's a loser, though. And all he did was talk about how Gemmel Moore died of full-blown AIDS. Gemmel Moore died of full-blown AIDS. He kept saying that over and over to the jury. He said that Timothy Dean died of a heart condition and that he was already living on borrowed time. So when you have an attorney that is willing to use the AIDS panic defense in defense of a white defendant who himself is HIV positive, that was absolutely horrific. And then to have DaBaby's comments, it just said to me, this is why Christopher Darden felt so comfortable going into court and saying to these jurors, no, Gemmel didn't die because of all the meth in his system. He died because he had full-blown AIDS. That was absolutely ridiculous. And the jury didn't like it. And they showed they didn't like it because they didn't find for the defendant. They found for the prosecution. We have to have these conversations. The other conversation, Mark, we also have to have, and I'm going to put this disclaimer on it. This has nothing to do with Gemmel Moore or his mother, but this is a fact. It has nothing to do with them. 90% of the men that came forward, the men that I spoke to, when I asked them how they ended up on the streets, it was because they told me they had gotten kicked out of their homes for being gay. We have to stop doing that because there are predators like Ed Buck waiting for your sons on the street, literally waiting for them. Ed Buck used to send people to Skid Row to bring back black men to him. He would call them the N-word. We saw video after video of unconscious black men being sexually assaulted and degraded and being called the worst ever names. This man was deranged. He was sick. He's the Jeffrey Dahmer of our generation. He literally is that. And he was able to get away with it because he was white and he had money. And everybody was willing to look the other way because they were survival sex workers, or they were HIV positive, or because they were homeless. We are not that disposable. We are not that disposable. And the few of us that are left here in LA, and the few of us who are left here in LA in terms of black people, we're going to stand up and we're going to fight. And we're going to also fight to stay in this city. And we're also going to fight for our brothers and sisters. This is an ongoing struggle. The Ed Buck is one part of this struggle because when it comes to homelessness in LA, black people are suffering. We cannot afford the rent. We are sleeping on the street. And our mayor and our electeds are not doing enough. It is not by design, Mark, that the majority of the homeless in LA are black when we only make up this much of the population here.
Wow. So much to think about. The intersections of race, class, gender, sexual identity, the stigma of sex work. So much stuff to unpack. We're going to keep unpacking it here on Black News Tonight. Jasmine, thank you so much for joining me. Everybody stay with me. Coming up next, we got a lot more.